Thank you for joining. My name is David Carroll, and I am with the California Association of Nonprofits. I am the Director of Education and Policy Programming, and we are more affectionately known as Cal Nonprofits. Cal Nonprofits is a statewide association serving the nonprofit community in California, and we serve over 10,000 members. We provide a peer community, educational opportunities, and advocacy for the sector. We have a robust public policy agenda, and central to that agenda is the issue of donor advised funds. DAFs are important to us, not just as a matter of principle. These resources are designated for the public good, but also from an operational point of view. Nonprofits need this money. We frequently hear that organizations need money now more than ever, which is true, but I think it's important to recognize that some nonprofits needed that money yesterday more than they needed it today. And they had to make very difficult decisions on how or if they would be able to serve their communities. So I think that's why this conversation today is so important. I have the honor of introducing our MC for the day, Susanna Morgan. Susanna is the CEO of the Oregon Food Bank. She's been a food banker for 26 years, or as she jokes, half of her life, at the San Francisco Food Bank, Inter-Seminarian Project Place, a homeless servicing agency and partner of the Boston Food Bank, and at the Food Bank of Alaska. Welcome, Susanna.
Thank you so much, David. We're so delighted to have you all here. Shout out to all of the food bankers who are joining us here. We had 160 register from 27 states, and I know this is new work in the food banking world, so we are so grateful to have you as part of this broader conversation and broader community. I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce our esteemed guests today. At least we think they're esteemed. I esteem them. So let's move the slide along and introduce the inimitable Vu Le. Vu writes the blog nonprofitaf.com, which if you don't subscribe to it, do that right now. Drop everything and go do that. Vu is the former ED of RVC, a nonprofit in Seattle that promotes social justice by supporting leaders of color, strengthening organizations led by communities of color, and fostering collaboration between diverse communities. In my experience, Vu is a leader in the conversation of equity, diversity, and inclusion in the nonprofit world. Vu, would you come off mute and turn on your video for just a second and tell everybody what your favorite vegetable is?
Good morning, Susanna. Are mushrooms a vegetable? I think they're a fungus, right? But I'm gonna go with mushrooms. And chanterelles are in season right now.
We will allow you chanterelles. Thank
Okay.
you, Vu. The next person I would like to introduce is Ray Madoff. Ray is a professor at Boston College Law School, where she teaches and writes on philanthropy, policy, taxes, property, and estate planning, but she's actually really fun and friendly despite that sentence. Ray is the co-founder and director of the Boston College Law School Forum on Philanthropy and the Public Good. Ray, would you come off mute and turn on your camera and tell us your favorite vegetable, please?
Absolutely. String beans, and can I add in garlic sauce, ideally?
Ooh, yum. That sounds amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have one more amazing human being joining us today. Chuck Collins is the director of the program on inequality and the common good at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he co-edits inequality.org, which you should also check out if you have not already. Chuck is an expert on US inequality and the racial wealth divide, and author of several books, including The Wealth Hoarders: How Billionaires Spend Millions to Hide Trillions. Chuck, would you come off mute and turn on your video and tell us your favorite? Chuck, there you are.
Looks like I'm not able to come off video for technical reasons the host has, but my favorite vegetable is garlic. So hopefully that garlic that is in Ray's string bean sauce. So there's the.
There we go. Now we have mushrooms and string beans and garlic sauce. This is all great. I would like to just say that I am Susanna Morgan. As you noticed, I'm the CEO of Oregon Food Bank. Oregon Food Bank is engaged and involved in these efforts and asks all the rest of our other food banks to be involved as well, because we are going through the worst crisis of my lifetime. The economic disruption surrounding the pandemic has caused the highest rates of hunger since the Great Depression. So we need all the money to be able to meet all the need. I want to close this sort of opening session by telling everyone that my favorite vegetable of the moment is Brussels sprouts. And I'd love to turn the mic over to Chuck.
Great. Let's see if my video can come on, but I'll just say I'm Chuck Collins. I'm at the Institute Studies and co-edit inequality.org. And I just wanted to set the agenda, which is that, just and where this is coming from. IPS is producing and hosting this event with tremendous help from CalNUTS and a number of the co-sponsors you saw. The reason we are engaged in this is IPS really focuses on issues of wealth inequality and the racial wealth divide. And our concern in relation to philanthropy is that philanthropy is more and more becoming an extension of the power and influence of the very wealthy. For over a decade, we've done this report, Gilded Giving, that looks at top-heavy philanthropy trends, looking at the ways in which small donor giving has been declining and nonprofits are increasingly dependent on ultra-wealthy donors. And we see all kinds of perils involved in that, including the fact that wealthy people give more likely through intermediaries like donor advised funds and private foundations. And so we're going to take a look at that today. But our view is it's time to modernize the rules governing philanthropy, that the framework that was created in 1969, the legal framework that we currently live with, could not have anticipated the extraordinary concentration of wealth and power that has flowed into the hands of a few. And we have this social contract, which is if a donor gives to a qualified charity, they enjoy a tax reduction, a tax benefit when they surrender, and this is the language of the law, surrender dominion and control. But what we're seeing is more and more wealthy people giving to private foundations, donor advised funds, where the funds are sidelines, where they, sometimes they flow, ideally they flow quickly, but often they're also waylaid or sidelined or warehoused. And so that's one of the concerns that brings us together, that that funds are being delayed on their way to recipient active charities. So what we're going to do is we are going to hear a presentation from Ray Madoff and then Boulay, just looking at this issue of donor advised funds and intermediaries, private foundations. Then we'll have a panel discussion. Suzanne will moderate a panel discussion with looking at the question of how policymakers can ensure that charities are able to tackle today's challenges. And then finally, we'll have a bit of a call to action, what we can do and how you can get involved. So that's our program, and I am going to turn it over to Ray.
Actually, we're going to turn it over to Vu.
To Vu first.
Little switcheroo.
Okay, first we're going to turn it to Vu. Sorry about that, and then to Ray. Thanks.
Thank you, Chuck. Hi, everyone. This is Vu. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm calling in from Seattle, which is on Duwamish and Coast Salish land. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today to talk about donor advised funds and foundations and everything. I know this can seem like a really dry topic, so I was asked to kind of talk about why we should care about this. If you read my blog, Nonprofit AF, that I've been ranting about the lack of funding for our sector for a long time. We have been putting up with just doing incredible work. So many of us have been doing incredible, amazing work with these very limited dollars. And we're just scrambling, clawing at these foundation grants and everything all the time, just for a small amount of money. And I think that we've been really, really nice about it for decades now, trying to really do incredible work, while a lot of the funding has been sitting in endowments and in donor advised funds. And I get really irritated because I I talked to a lot of foundations and they're like, we're saving for a rainy day. That's why we're only giving out 5% of our endowments every year. We're saving the other 95% for a rainy day. And for a long time, this has been the argument that has been given to us. And I find that this is a really terrible and bullshit sort of argument, right? They're like saving up. It's like everything is on fire and they're saving up for future fires. And it just doesn't make any sense because future fires are caused by the current fires that we are not putting out. I remember talking to a foundation once who was an environmental funder, and I said, what are you doing? We only have a few more years left before climate change is irreversible. And this program officer was like, well, there's still going to be problems. So we have to save up for future environmental problems, which makes no sense. We're not going to have a world left to save. I think that in many ways, we've been very nice here in the sector. We've just been extremely nice and patient in the sector. And so we've been putting up with all sorts of terrible things, including this hoarding that has been done by donors and by funders. And I think it has kind of turned our sector into the Sky Mall catalog in a way, where we start, kind of letting funders and donors like not pay their fair share of taxes and then squirrel all this money away and then get to work on the issues that they care about, right? And we become the Sky Mall catalog where they get to choose different causes that resonate with them. And this is problematic when we talk about like who has all this money in the first place. Why is it there? A lot of the money that is being squirreled away is by white-led foundations and by white donors. And a lot of the money a lot of wealth in this country has been built on terrible inequities, including slavery and stolen indigenous lands, worker exploitation, environmental degradation, and tax avoidance. And so just to let people just kind of take this money, not pay their fair share of taxes, and then squirrel it away. And we are kind of expected to just kind of scramble along and trying to do things. I find that to be incredibly terrible and inequitable as well. So I want us to not be so nice anymore. I want us to start getting angry, and I want us to stop being so patient with everyone. I think we've been way patient for such a long time now. And especially over the past 3 years, I've been seeing incredible work being done by organizations, food pantries, food banks, basic needs organizations, but also arts and civic engagements, and environmental organizations who are just doing amazing work, just incredible work. I mean, they've always been doing awesome work. Over the past 3 years, we've been so flexible and so patient. And I think that we're at a point now where we just cannot be this patient anymore. Our communities need us to be able to do our work, and we need the resources to do the work. That there's over $1 trillion just sitting in endowments and donor advice funds. And what are we saving for? We're saving for a rainy day when it is pouring on our communities right now. And these laws and these things and our own niceness have been contributing to this sort of terrible system that we find ourselves in. And I am getting really pissed, and I hope that you are too. And I think that we can actually, if we can mobilize, if we can start organizing and being louder and more assertive, I think that we can get the resources that we need, that our communities need, for us to do an effective job. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Madoff, who is way more knowledgeable about this issue than I am. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vu. It's so important to hear your contribution, and you are the man, among others, but you are the leader in speaking truth to power. So it's wonderful to be on a panel with you. So as Susanna mentioned, I'm the tax person, which maybe some of you think like, oh, this is boring, but it is tremendously important because the tax rules governing charitable giving affect the flow of money to each and every one of your organizations. It plays a tremendously important role. And I think that people sometimes like to pretend that the tax rules are too complicated for regular people to understand. And I think when they do that, it is a way of controlling and keeping power and keeping people from speaking. And what I want to talk to you about today is that the rules governing charitable giving are not too complicated to understand. And what one can easily see when we trace some of the history is that the rules have been intended to benefit your organizations, but something has happened over the years and those rules have gotten distorted. And that's what I want to talk about now. So if we could turn to the next slide, please. Great. So I just want to start with some basic ground rules, which many people know, which is that in order to support charities, the federal government and some state governments, but primarily the federal government, provides very generous tax benefits to encourage charitable giving. And so there are income tax benefits, capital gains tax benefits, and estate and gift tax benefits. And together, these benefits can be worth as much as 74% of the donation. What that means is that people who make a donation of $10 million, somebody who is a well-planned gift of $10 million might, after tax, only contribute $2.6 million because they receive $7.4 million in tax benefits. And so that's a really big number, right? The fact that the government contribution in all of this is as much as 74% of the donation. It means that all of us should care, not just as charities, but as fellow taxpayers, because this is money that could otherwise be spent on different programs. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so back in 1969, Chuck mentioned 1969. Some of you might think 1969 and think Woodstock, or you might think, you know, First Man on the Moon. I think Tax Reform Act of 1969, because that's the year that Congress began to express concern about a distortion of the tax rules so that they were being used not directly to benefit charities, but were being used for donor-controlled funds. And in 1969, Congress created our current structure for charitable giving, which said that basically there were two different types of organizations. One was public charities like food banks and all the other charities that we think of that are doing all that important work. And public charities, contributions to public charities were given the maximum tax benefits and very little disclosure obligations. Donations to private foundations, however, and these are donor-controlled, basically bank accounts, money set aside, organizations that don't themselves engage in charitable work, but they are simply putting money aside for future charitable giving. Though private foundations, they said contributions to those would receive fewer tax benefits, and they were made subject to a 5% payout rule, which many of you might have heard of. A 5% payout rule is the rule that requires private foundations to distribute 5% of their assets each year. It also requires private foundations to disclose their giving. Okay, this distinction between public charities and private foundations that created an incentive intended to get more money to charities actually gave rise to the Donor Advised Fund. And next slide, please. Okay, so what is a donor advised fund? A donor advised fund is something that's really rather clever. What it is it looks like an outright contribution to a public charity. So from a tax point of view, the donor to a donor advised fund gets the maximum tax benefits, the same benefits that he or she would get giving to a food bank or other public charity. However, unlike a real outright gift to charity that is currently available for public use, in a donor advised fund, the sponsor of the fund, they segregate that money They don't spend it for charitable purpose. They segregate it and keep it subject to the donor's advice, right? And because this has all happened sort of on an outside of the law basis, right? They call it advice instead of mandate. The donor gets all the tax benefits as if they had actually given up complete dominion and control, even though they haven't. This makes a donor advised fund similar to a private foundation, minus the oversight and payout rules that applies to private foundations. Next slide. So you might wonder, who are these public charities that are acting as DAF sponsors? Beginning in 1991, the financial services industry got very involved, and some of the biggest donor advised fund sponsors have names that sound more like banks: Fidelity Charitable, Schwab Charitable, Vanguard Charitable. And you also have a lot of community foundations. The largest community foundation DAF sponsor is Silicon Valley Community Foundation, but there are many other organizations, community foundations, and other organizations that serve as DAF sponsors. The point is that these are organizations that are taking in donations. For tax purposes, it looks like the organization controls the money, but the understanding is they're just going to segregate it and keep it in a separate account for the donor's ongoing control. Needless to say, these have been very popular with donors. They're a kind of have your cake and eat it too type of donation. You get to get your charitable tax deduction, but you still get to have the property and to control its disposition later on. Let's look at how popular these donor advised funds have been and have become. Next slide, please. So you see in 2007, the first year where there was donations, any sizable donations, we began to keep track of them. $10.1 billion. In 2020, this is just a mere 13 years later, the annual contribution is almost $48 billion. That's just 1 year's contribution. So every year, more and more contributions are going. By the way, the growth of contributions outright to working charities is like 3% a year. And to donor advised funds, it's like 17 to 20% a year. So really astronomical growth in donor advised funds in terms of contributions to donor advised funds. What about the assets? What about the assets that are held in donor advised funds? Take a look at the next slide. The assets under management have grown astronomically as well. In 2020, there is almost $160 billion in donor advised funds. In 2022, I'm sure that number is even greater. And look at how quickly those numbers are growing. In 2016, there was about half that amount. In 2020, it doubled. So we're seeing a huge growth in these assets. Now, you might think that what we're doing here is expanding the pie. We've brought in all sorts of new money, and the proponents of DAFs will say, oh, this is great. They've just attracted more dollars. But there's a very interesting slide from the Lilly School, which tracks this information. And let's go to the next slide. This is a slide that shows annual giving as a percentage of disposable income. Disposable income is basically like how much money people have. And it's a very interesting slide because tracking all the way back to 1979, you see that charitable giving has remained remarkably constant at about 2% of disposable income. And in fact, if you look at more recent years, not only have DAFs not increased charitable giving, but our giving is almost at historic lows, down at 1.8 and 1.85%. So we are not expanding the pie. What we're doing instead is we are shifting more money into donor advised funds. Now you might think, well, maybe we're taking away money from private foundations, so maybe that's not so bad. But let's take a look at the next slide. Here, this shows the growth of funds. It's a little hard to see the years on the bottom there, but basically, the first time we have good data on donor advised funds is from 2007. And so what this shows, I'm going to take a minute to show what this is. This is the percentage of individual giving that is going to intermediaries as opposed to outright to working charities. If we go back to 1991, which is the first slide here, 95% of all charitable giving went outright to your organizations. Okay, there were very few donor advised funds, there were private foundations, but the vast majority of charitable giving, remember that 2% of disposable income, the vast majority of charitable giving went outright to charities. Only 5% went to intermediaries. The amount that went to donor advised funds, it began in 2007, our first number was 4%. Now 15% of all charitable giving goes to donor advised funds, and yet another 15% of charitable giving goes to private foundations. What that means is today, 30% of each year's charitable giving is going to these intermediaries. Now, why is this a problem? Next slide, please. Right now, there is $1.4 trillion currently set aside in private foundations and donor advised funds. And the reason this is a problem is, one more slide. There is currently no requirement for these funds to ever make their way to charity. First of all, donor advised funds under current law are not subject to any payout rules. People are treated as if they have done everything they need to do when they've simply set aside the money in the donor advised funds. Well, what about private foundations? Private foundations are subject to a 5% payout rule. But out of a perversion, the way the rules work today, payout can be met, first of all, by paying salaries to family members, but also by giving to donor advised funds, which have no further payout requirement. What that means is that private foundations no longer have a payout requirement, even though Congress explicitly gave them one in 1969. Next slide. All of this has given rise to the Accelerating Charitable Efforts Act. This is one of several responses that people are talking about, but there's currently a bill in Congress. It does a number of things to get more money out of intermediaries and into your organizations. Most importantly, for the next slide, the ACE Act, which is what we call Accelerating Charitable Efforts, protects charities and restores legitimacy to our tax rules by, first of all, providing rules to ensure that donor advised funds make their way to charity, and preventing private foundations from meeting, or shall we say, avoiding their 5% payout by giving to donor advised funds. Next slide. I look forward in our next section to talking about taking questions or comments, and look forward to it. Thank you so much, everybody.
Okay, so now Ray has blown everybody's mind with an enormous amount of data. And we have 600 people on this call, which means there's 607 brains exploding across the United States. And maybe we have some folks outside of the 58 states also joining us. So I would like to invite Ray, Vu, and Chuck to come back on screen for us to have a little bit of a conversation together. This is your stir fry, folks. Brussels sprouts, string beans, mushrooms, and garlic. We are one healthy stir fry of information for you today. I would like to start us off, and Chuck, since you have been quiet the longest, I'm going to start with you. Just start asking you, why do you care? Why are you involved in this webinar and in this topic?
Well, I think that, I think Vu and Ray both sort of set the stage perfectly, which is the original intent was for this money to flow. And a huge amount of charitable dollars is getting sidelined, is getting waylaid. And one thing I care about is if we as taxpayers are encouraging or effectively subsidizing this effort, this charitable giving, we should make sure that it's delivering. And Ray mentioned the statistic, but just to kind of say it another way, because it really kind of hits me, is think about this, for every dollar that a billionaire gives to their own private foundation or donor advised fund, we, the taxpayer, chip in 74 cents in the form of lost tax revenue. That's why there is a public interest. That's why we're having this conversation. If people weren't asking the rest of us to subsidize their charitable giving, it would be private. And some people do give. Many people give without getting a tax break. Many working class and low-income people give to community organizations and charities. They don't get a tax break. The richer you are, the higher percentage of your income you get to deduct using these intermediaries, not just because of income tax reductions, but as Ray said, because you're reducing your estate tax, your gift tax, and your capital gains. So the one way to think about this is our tax dollars at work. In the same way we don't want tax dollars misappropriated, we don't want charitable dollars misallocated or delayed. And as Ray said, $1.4 trillion warehoused in these intermediaries. So that to me is kind of hits me right where it counts, in terms of just the insult really to us as citizens and residents of this country when so much money is sidelined or warehoused.
Yeah, thank you so much. Ray, and you were obviously an expert on how we got here. I'm curious, you could be working on a lot of things. What caught your intellectual and emotional curiosity and outrage about this particular issue?
Well, I think that this is an issue that people tend to think of as like some small little corner of the tax law. But in fact, it's actually the one that is most critically important in terms of the future, I think, of our democracy. Because if you think about it, it is these charitable tax rules that are going to keep the wealthiest Americans, Musk, Bezos, Gates, every single one of our favorite centibillionaires, right? Chances are none of them are going to pay any taxes at all, because in most cases, people end up putting their money into some form of a privately controlled charitable vehicle in the end, rather than paying taxes. And if we don't expect anything from this money, we are undermining all of our government resources and not getting anything in return. The other thing is that we count on charities to do the most critical work in this country. And we are starving charities by our failure to stand up for these rules that are intended to get money to charities and the beneficiaries they serve.
Great, thank you. Vu, you've been thinking about and writing a lot about how the traditions of philanthropy have upheld dominant culture. I'm wondering how you think how reforming DAF fits into your concept of a just philanthropy, a transition to a form of philanthropy that will lead us towards social justice.
Yeah, I think this is just the bare minimum that we need to be doing, right? I mean, like the ACE Act is so mild. I mean, what does it say? Like, if I became a millionaire, probably through cryptocurrency, probably not, I don't know. But like, if I did, and I just gave out a bunch of money, I put into a DAF, right? Right now, I have I can just take the tax benefits and then just not have to give it out to any charity at all, forever, like ever. I can just like leave that for like next 800 years. I mean, the ACE Act is just like, actually, you can take a tax break, but you need to give out within 15 years. 15 years! Even that is like way too long. Like if I were in charge, it needs to be given out within the next 3 years. Okay, so this is like a very mild thing. And I wanted to need to just pass this act because we have more important things to do. We are not going to be able to address systemic injustice if even like a very mild set of reform is being opposed. Like I want us to move beyond this so we can start talking about reparation and returning stolen indigenous land. And we need to talk about like just how white wealth has been, how this is like a vehicle for white people to keep holding wealth and power. And, and we have just been like having this learned helplessness over the decades of like, oh, there's nothing we can do. I guess we're just gonna have to like figure out how to reach these donor advice holders, and we need to just apply for their crappy proposals and shit like that. And I was like, I don't want us to deal with that anymore. Like our work is way too important for us to put up with this bullshit all the time.
Vu, tell it like it is. Tell it like it is. I wanted to let you all know that I am watching the question section. They're coming in fast and furious, and it's amazing. We had planned to have a bit of a conversation. Chuck was going to do a wrap, and then we would move on to questions. I want to make sure that we spend a chunk of time on these questions because there's some nice chewy ones in there. So we'll just do a little bit more time with some of our pre-thoughts, and then we'll move into questions. So Chuck, one of the questions that we thought of ahead of time was, my nonprofit hasn't really been involved in thinking about taxes and tax reforms. That's not something that we have paid any attention to. Vu says, come on, get this out of the way. Why would you say start here?
I think the nonprofit sector on these issues of both tax policy and philanthropy reform has kind of been missing in action for the most part. The national associations of nonprofits and others have sort of stuck with the status quo. Not everybody. And in fact, I think one of the reasons why we're excited about doing this conversation and continuing to do more of these roadshows is we need a constituency to move a reform agenda, to change the rules governing philanthropy. And the nonprofit sector is one of those constituencies, along with people who care about democracy, racial justice, tax fairness, inequality. That's the big tent. But the nonprofit, I think people are afraid that they will alienate their donors if they start talking about reforming charity laws. And I guess I would just want to say there's safety in numbers, and it's really important to speak out. What Vu has done is, through a channel that he has talking to nonprofits, is saying, let's grow some spine in this conversation. Let's not accept the status quo, because that's what's missing here. The defenders of the status quo, the foundations, the donor advice fund, commercial sponsors, even the community foundations, are all lobbying to not change the laws, defend the status quo. And what's going to be the counterweight to that? So, if you're sitting there as a nonprofit, unfortunately, we don't have the luxury anymore. We have to pay attention to these larger trends, tax inequity, tax fairness, and how these laws governing philanthropy work or don't work.
Thank you so much. Chuck Rice, making sure her light turns back on, answering the most important question I've seen so far, which is, yes, we have all admired Chuck's mushroom poster behind his head. See, we really are the best stir fry you will ever get on a webinar. Ray, you talked a lot about how we got here. There are a lot of ways to fix this, but some may be sort of more on the table right now. Is there something that you would like to lift as things that are moving right now?
Yes, I think the thing that's actually one of the leading points is this idea of closing the gap about private foundations being able to meet payout by giving to a donor advised fund. That clearly is completely undermines the whole purpose of the rules, and so much so that is part of President Biden's proposal. So this is something that is in President Biden's budget, and so I think that's a provision that most immediately has the most legs. And of course, I think the ACE Act on its own is also a very powerful, as Vu said, it is a modest reform, but it's a very important reform because what it does is it brings charities back into the charitable donation, that is what we need. That's the message the Congress has to hear, which is we should not be writing charities out of charitable tax benefits. And I do want to make one thing really clear, which is this is not about that donor advised funds are bad or private foundations are bad or that people who have them are bad. This is not that at all. The truth is, there's a number of reasons. I'm happy to talk to anybody another time about this, that people are opening donor advised funds for very reasonable, appropriate, good reasons. These are not evil things. But the problem is, it's Congress needs to, and this is particularly so with the change of the standard deduction and with rules about appreciated property, blah, blah, blah taxes. But what's really important is that the rules deliver money to charities. So it's not about saying that anybody is any person is bad, donors are bad. It is about the rules being bad and about Congress needing to respond. And I do think we have people that are proponents of the status quo, because wherever you have piles of money, remember we have $1.4 trillion aside, you have people who benefit financially from managing that money. And I do think those are the powerful interests that can oppose legislation that would rather have the money under management than get the money to the charities.
Yeah, with structures form the way we ask the questions, right? I cheerfully, literally cheerfully pay my taxes every year because I like schools and roads and clean air. And I take a deduction for my mortgage because the rules say I can, right? The rules will drive behavior. Because obviously, if it was the wrong thing to do, there'd be a rule preventing me from doing it. So we've got to take it out of good and evil people or good and evil organizations into good and evil, or at least pro-social change or anti-social change structures, and changing those structures. So if it's cool with the whole panel, I'm going to turn it over to Chuck to sort of wrap up this section and then move on to questions. Or Chuck, would you prefer we do questions and then do the wrap? What's your garlic preference here?
I think I have more of a closing, maybe, an action oriented. So let's maybe hear questions.
Let's do
from
questions then.
Yeah.
So then let me ask each of our panelists then to put your eyes through the questions. And pick out one that just you're like, I need to answer that. That's really critical for me to answer. Probably the more complicated ones, not just we can answer it with a little note around how it actually works. So is there, is anyone seeing one? I saw one for you, Vu, earlier, which was related to how the shifting of dollars will help BIPOC organizations. Did you see that one?
Yeah, well, look, it's the shifting of dollars is not going to automatically go immediately to organizations led by Black, Indigenous, people of color. I think we're going to need to be really thoughtful. But right now, there's this huge excuse that funders and donors have been using, which is there's only so much money to go around. And that's why we're going to focus on giving it to the organizations that wrote the best grant applications or whatever, right? I think that we need to get more money out the door. And we also need more concerted efforts to actually get the new money to actually go specifically to organizations that are most, that are working with communities that are most affected by systemic injustice right now. And we've been seeing it happening. It's been working when we organize. So for example, in Seattle, a bunch of executive directors of color got together, about 180 of us got together, wrote an open letter to funders saying, look, there's a pandemic, our communities are suffering. Please double out the amount of money that you're giving out. Make sure that it's going to BIPOC-led organizations, the multi-year general operating funds. Please sign this pledge saying that you will do that. And guess what? Several foundations did sign the pledge and did double the amount of money that they're giving out here in Washington State. So I think we just need to be more thoughtful about how we organize because it is effective.
Great. Thank you so much, Vu. Ray, you've got one?
I found one, yes. So somebody was concerned that the rules regarding private foundations that have a 5% payout rule some have said that it anchors the private foundation, so they spend 5% and they don't spend more. There might be some truth to that, and they say, therefore, aren't you going to have a problem if you have a rule for donor advised funds? And the point is this: first of all, the donor advised fund rules that are proposed under the ACE Act generally are not a 5% rule. They provide a 15-year term or else a delayed benefit rule. So they don't create that 5% issue that some people are concerned about. So it's really, again, about how one structures the rules. That is a problem with private foundations about the 5%. The reason it was enacted that way was because Congress decided that it was okay for organizations to exist in perpetuity, and a 5% payout allowed that. But there's no reason for a donor advised fund to exist in perpetuity. So
Yep, fabulous. Chuck, did you see a question that spoke to you?
Yeah, there's a similar question about addressing sort of multi-generational control of DAFs and foundations. And this actually ties into some polling that we've been doing, which is, so just to back up, I think, the context for the conversation is we have this multi-generational racial wealth divide, but at the same time, we are seeing this updraft, this concentration of wealth in, the billionaires and the centimillionaires who are creating multi-generational foundations and sort of dynastic wealth. So another part of the work I do looks at trusts and concentrated wealth. And we're talking tens of trillions of dollars that the current ultra wealthy are sequestering, putting outside the reach of taxation, and putting some of that money into perpetual charitable institutions. And I just think that we should be waving a red flag from a democracy point of view, that basically you have the wealthiest people in our society, and as we would underscore, these are white, multi-generational wealthy families with huge levers of power. They're using that power politically, they're using that power through charity. And that is a really alarming concern. And one of the things that we discovered as we polled on these issues, and I'll talk a little bit about this, is when you say to people, should we give wealthy people a tax break to create a closely held, family-controlled, perpetual private foundation that has minimal requirements for payout? It doesn't pass the common sense test. People understand, like, wait a second, we're subsidizing the wealthiest people in our society to create private foundations where their unborn great-grandchildren will still be deciding where the money's going to go, that has no public oversight, very limited requirements for payout. So that's where I think part of this conversation has to look at this idea of perpetual foundations that will exist for generations. Is that really the best public interest and best use of tax dollars? So I think this is a really good place to both look at what are the most immediate policies like the ACE Act, but let's also, shouldn't we be revisiting the framework here? Because that doesn't look like surrendering dominion and control. When you have these billionaires sitting on multi-billion-dollar foundations for generations, what part of surrender, dominion, and control are we missing here?
And if I can, I just want to second some of that point that Chuck is making, which is that the capacity to control wealth for charitable good. Sometimes people will say, well, what do you care? They've committed money to charity. But when you're talking about controlling power in the world, the capacity to control wealth confers tremendous power on people. And that's why I actually view endowments held by charities different from endowments held in a private foundation. At least an endowment held in a working charity, even if the money isn't being spent today, it has been, the charity has it available to it to use. It can borrow against the funds. It can plan for the future, knowing it has those funds. So I'm not necessarily anti all endowments, but there's a difference between an endowment in a charity and money that is just controlled by an individual or a family in perpetuity with no obligation for it to ever come out.
I'm personally kind of opposed to endowments for food banks because I think they say we should exist from now till the end of time. And I don't believe that. I think we should end hunger. Endowment for a university, there's some difference, right? Vu, you look like you were getting ready to chime in.
Yeah, I was just thinking how much nicer Chuck and Ray are than I am. One of the questions is like, if this is about like wealthy people hoarding money, then why don't we just focus legislation on like the people who are like millionaires and billionaires? Why are we going after like the people with $100,000 that they can just, pass on to their kids for a legacy of grant making? And I'm like, a legacy of grant making, that is that's just gross to think about that. I'm like, what do you, this is not a hobby. I think we need to get out of this philosophy of like philanthropy as the hobby for the rich, you know, where they can just to get to like save money and then they like get to choose the little causes and programs that they find to be resonating with them. Like I find it to be so gross how we just enable that as a sector to be like, oh, rich people, it's your money, you get to do whatever you want with it, and this is your pet project, go ahead and do that. You know, it's your money. And it's like, first of all, it's not your money, you know, when so much of wealth has been built again on like terrible inequities. So it's not a lot of rich people's money. Second of all, like Chuck and Ray have said, like we are subsidizing as taxpayers when they don't pay money, when they hoard this money away. We as taxpayers are subsidizing because they should have been paying that money in there in taxes, right? So this belief that you can just save money away as like a hobby for your family members later on, so they can like, oh, I love this dog nursing home, or I love this park, or whatever. Like those are all great causes, but like the idea that rich white people can just pick and choose the issues that most resonate with them, I find to be incredibly distasteful. Like the boat that we're all in are just sinking, and we're like, hey, we need everyone to like bail out, you know, grab a bucket. And we're rich people are like, I'm sorry, but the bucket doesn't really resonate with me. I want my grandkids to choose whether they want to pick up a pail or not. Like, you know, like that's their choice. Like that's just bullshit. Why are we even allowing this? Why do we think that's okay?
I would
Can we
just
get an amen?
Well, I would just echo, maybe we haven't said it clearly. Philanthropy, you know, there's some good work happening, but it's not a substitute for a fair tax system where the wealthy pay their fair share of taxes and we have robust, democratically governed public investments at the state, local, and federal level. It's, you know, we kind of need to say that all the time when we're talking about the limits of philanthropy. And I would, you know, at a certain point, billionaires should be paying, they should be paying way more taxes, and we should be less distracted by the philanthropic acts, which is kind of what's happening. We're inundated with stories about generous billionaires and what they're doing with their money when they're not giving to political campaigns, or you know, they're giving to universities and hospitals with their names on. That kind of celebration of billionaire philanthropy is part of what we need to shift as a culture. That's my nice way of saying it, right, Vu? So you know, I think that comes back to maybe gifts above a certain threshold are no longer deductible. And I can tell one anecdote, which is I used to work with Bill Gates's dad, Bill Gates Sr., who is a great champion of effective inheritance taxes and estate taxes, both in Washington state and nationally. And he once said to me, you know, don't you think there's something wrong that my son can give $100 billion to his private foundation and never pay any taxes on that 100 billion in Microsoft wealth? There's something wrong with that. Maybe there should be a cap. Maybe it's pretty high up, but maybe it's a cap. It's not, you don't get to opt out of paying taxes. And philanthropy should not be an opt out for paying your fair share of taxes. And a period.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Ray.
I would do some technical amendment to that general concept. I do agree that I think that people should be paying taxes and that philanthropy is not an adequate substitute for taxes. I think dollar caps tend to have a disruptive effect though. So if I could just be part of a technical response, I would, there are other ways of ensuring that people pay a tax. But you do, you know, when you think about what do we want our centibillionaires to do with their money, we have to, they exist, we have to want them to do something with it. And so if you just say, so a lot of good work can be done through philanthropy. I'm sure people on this webinar can do a lot of things with money. You're talking about, you know, addressing hunger. There's so many needs in the world that can use the resources. I think we can limit the tax benefits without imposing a cap. And that would be that would be better. And I do, as I say, I want to reiterate one important point, which is a number of people have expressed concerns in the questions about, like, should we be discouraging our donors from using donor advised funds or private foundations? And I would really discourage that. It's not a problem. There are reasons having to do with the, for example, what I mentioned earlier, because of the standard deduction, the increase in the standard deduction that happened under Trump, people do not get any benefit for the 90% of Americans get no benefit for their annual charitable giving. And so a lot of people are using a DAF to group together 3 years of giving, get some charitable tax benefits for their giving, and then they fully empty out those accounts over 3 years or 4 years. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with the vehicle of the DAF. It's useful for a lot of reasons, but it's the point that we need to have rules around them.
Yep. So I think I'm the working charity on this call. About 100 feet that way is 5 million pounds of food and 20 trucks that is serving all of Oregon. So as a working charity, I just want to lift up that I'm seeing a lot of whatabouts in the questions. You know, is the problem DAFs, or is the problem that we with just charitable, using philanthropy to solve problems? Or is the problem DAFs, or is the problem that we should take away the charitable deduction altogether and raise corporate and individual wealth taxes? Or is the problem DAFs, or is the problem capitalism? Settler colonial capitalism, as my indigenous friends would say. And the answer is yes. Yes, to all of those. But Vu has written very compellingly about sort of analysis paralysis that we get to in the, we want so hard to get at the root that we're not willing to do the things that we can do right now. And so I'm just wanting to urge people on this, this call to be willing to prune. This is a pruning. We can do this pruning. It is useful pruning. It will free up some more resources for us to do the next stage of our work towards getting to social justice. Okay, let me turn the mic back over to Vu. Vu, what is your curiosity doing at this point, or the things that you're wanting to make sure get said?
Susanna, sorry, you were sounding kind of, was it just me, or Susanna's audio was terrible?
Oh no! Ah!
Something happened.
All right, is my audio back?
Oh, yeah, it's perfect now. Thank you.
Beautiful.
You can't get through an entire webinar without a technical glitch, right? I mean, that's the rule.
That's the rule.
Uh-oh.
Okay, now you sound like a chipmunk, Susanna. This.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it was amusing for a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna have to move on without our fearless leader.
Yeah, move on.
Oh no, there you are. You're back.
You sound great. I think we're talking about action steps now. Yeah.
Yes. Vu, action steps.
Yeah, well, I think first of all, supporting the ACE legislation is and get, I don't know, aware of it. I think it's been so wonky that when people talk about it, right, that when I bring it up, people are like, I don't really know anything about DAF, and I don't plan to. We're like, look, they are growing. There's going to be more and more money, and it's going to affect our sector. It has been affecting our sector quite a bit. So you need to get engaged. You need to talk to community foundations and figure out what it is that they're doing around this and whether they're supporting this, and encourage them to support it. There's some really great state legislations like Cal nonprofits that are leading the work in this legislation, and it'll be important to support them. Yeah, and I don't know, I think just being more assertive, like I would really like for us to start writing more op-eds and being out there, because people don't realize that, I think if we're quiet, then people just assume that we are opposed to the legislation. So I would encourage you, when you have time and energy, to actually go out and read up on this issue, write op-eds about it, talk about the issue more so that it's more in the public sphere. That's what I got so far. Yeah, Chuck and Ray.
Yeah, let me just close with a couple of action steps. And I think, Ray mentioned, the fact that private foundations can consider a donation to a DAF as a qualified distribution. That's like a small turn of the dial, but not insignificant. The second is payout. You know, donor advised funds should have a payout. And actually, there's a slide that just put up about polling, and you know, and we can share this information. But what's interesting is all the reforms we're talking about here are wildly popular. When people are, you know, when we ask the wider public, not people who work in the sector, not people who work at foundations, but the wider public, what do they think? You know, most people have no idea what we're talking about, right? What's a donor advised fund? What's a private foundation? But once they understand those dynamics, the common sense response is like, wait a second, you mean to say people can create a family foundation that is family members only making decisions, and that they can take that money and put it in a foundation in perpetuity? So most people are like, 81% say don't subsidize perpetual foundations. And when you ask people, you know, things like, do you support reform for increased payout? Across the spectrum, 70% of conservatives want private foundation payout to go up to 10%. 76% want donor advised funds to pay out within 5 years. Most people, Vu said, DAFs should pay out in 3 years. Wide polling shows the majority of people want payout within 2 years. So the whole idea that we as taxpayers subsidize this sector, the public, the appetite for bolder reforms is tremendous. And let me just, you know, say, let me shift to another slide just to say there is one action item that we're asking people on this call to do, you know, and we will be following up with more information, with links, with papers, with links to research. But if you go to inequality.org/charity, there's a letter that you can send to members of Congress asking them to take bold action on these charity reforms. So that's something, while you're just sitting here, you can immediately do that. And again, part of our challenge here is we need to build a constituency. We need people in the nonprofit sector to use their voice and be a counterweight to the defenders of the status quo. And let's be clear, the private foundations and their association, the donor advised funds and their professional groups are pushing back, even against the ACE Act, which is a very incremental, you know, important first step, but it's not the full, you know, full taco that we want here. So check out and sign on to that. And the other thing you can do is, we would love to take this virtual roadshow to lots of audiences. So if you're part of a regional network of nonprofit organizations or foundations, some different constellations of us would be happy to come and continue these conversations in smaller groups and others. So think about that. You know, part of our organizing work is to do education and engage people. So that's an immediate thing, but you know, check out also Gilded Giving, the report that we do. We'll put those links that looks at kind of the menu of charity reforms, because it's really important that we put out some bolder, big marker legislation as well, and build a constituency of support around it. So those are a couple of things. And just to remember, the public, the wider public, when we talk about this, backs bigger and bolder reforms than currently what's being talked about. And people have asked along the way, and if you join late, we will have a recording of this. We will send out to everybody who registered a link to the recording and to some of the resources that we've been talking about, and an invitation to you organizing another public event. So that's and I also just, you know, again, want to thank the whole crew here, and Susanna, who's played a tremendous leadership role in the state of Oregon, testified before Congress, brought a lot of our food bank friends together to have this conversation. Cal Nonprofits, which has introduced legislation both at the state level in California to reform DAFs and has received huge pushback. These are all, and Voulet with his blog and his communication, traveling the world, talking about these issues. This is, these are really important constituents, leaders. And as you heard Ray talking about, kind of the research. So we continue to kind of put out the information, but we need people to be engaged and use your voice for advancing this charity reform agenda. Maybe back to Susanna.
So grateful for this time. My audio is working. Yes. With everyone. I would wrap up by quoting Frederick Douglass, that power concedes nothing without a demand. We need to demand. Let's all join together in demanding that we fix this. And then when we show we can do that, we can move on to even bigger and better things together. So thank you all for spending this time with us. We know you are all busy out there changing the world in whatever capacity that you have, educating, doing charity work, doing social justice work, funding the work. We are so grateful for you. We will stay in touch, and feel free to reach out to any of the three of us. We are happy to support you along your journey. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
everyone.
Susanna.